Okay then, so I suppose 3 of 5 is good enough to start. Okay then, so today we're moving on to the general formats of these lectures going forward. So I think I've introduced you now, firstly to the sort of general historical context in the 18th, 19th and early 20th centuries, and we've discussed the sort of background of Peter the Great's reforms and Peter the Great's reforms themselves. And going forward, what we're going to do is take a theme of religion, of the church, in each lecture, and then go and observe how that theme changed from sort of the beginning of the 18th century until the end of the Imperial period in 1917. And so today's first lecture is going to be precisely about the relationship between the church and the state, and how this transformed over time. Now, often in these lectures, I'm going to use the beginning to introduce you to some conceptual framework, to some concepts which are used often by historians to discuss developments within these particular subjects. And I'm also going to introduce you into some debates and controversies between historians and other commentators about these subjects. So you can get a better understanding from a conceptual point of view of what is occurring, and also understand these subjects have been heavily debated, not just recently, but over centuries. And that we have arrived at the understanding that we have today through the course of long debates, long discussions between historians and other political, social, and cultural commentators. Okay? So the concept I want to introduce today is one that's going to be, before we go and start our narrative with the creation of the Holy Synod in 1721, the beginning of the so-called synodal period of church history that lasts from 1721 to 1917, I want to introduce you to a concept you're going to come across frequently in your readings and which is useful in this context, which is the idea of Russia as a confessional state. Now, what do I mean by a confessional state? Well, a confessional state is, generally speaking, a state with an official religion, and where the relationship between that religion and the state is mutually supporting. So the state supports their official church or their official religion, and that official religion supports the state. Now, in the 18th century, Russia was certainly not alone in being a confessional state. Most European states, most states across the world, were in some way or the other confessional states. So in 18th century France, for instance, was a Catholic confessional state. Prussia, the main northern German state, was, well, technically speaking, a Protestant, both Calvinist and Lutheran confessional state. Sweden was a Lutheran confessional state. Russia was an Orthodox confessional state. Possibly the only exceptions we can really talk about to this in the 18th century might be the United States. After its formation in the late 18th century, was a state which officially divided church and state from each other. France, after the Revolution, in 1789, also divided church and state. Now, of course, today we have the confessional state is much more rare, especially in sort of Europe and what we would call broadly the Western world. Most states are today like Estonia, like the modern Russian Federation, like modern France, like modern Italy. They are secular states. There is usually a division between church and state. The state in religious terms, the state acts as supposedly a neutral referee between various religions, while guaranteeing freedom of religion and the freedom of conscience of each individual citizen. England, by the way, is something of an exception in that it is still an officially Anglican, a Church of England state. The Queen is the head of the Church of England, and the bishops of the Church of England have automatic seats in the House of Lords, the second seat of the second chamber of the parliamentary system. But of course, England in everything has to be old-fashioned and an exception. So what does being a confessional state mean for Russia in the 18th, 19th, early 20th centuries? Well, it means that Orthodoxy is the official religion of the state. In the Imperial Law Code, Orthodoxy is called the preeminent and predominant religion of the Russian Empire. And this has several legal consequences and administrative consequences. So basically, the church had various privileges that other religious groups in the Russian Empire did not hold. For one, the emperor, his wife, and his children had to belong to Orthodoxy. So if you married the Russian emperor or Russian empress, that meant conversion to Orthodoxy. It also meant in the law code, the Russian state protected the interests of the Russian church. So, for instance, it was forbidden to convert away from Russian Orthodoxy. And trying to convert away could be punished. Trying to promote the causes of faiths other than Russian Orthodoxy, trying to be a missionary for a different faith, for instance, in the Russian Empire, was a criminal offense, punishable by fines, imprisonment, and even exile to Siberia. Blasphemy was a criminal offense. So in other words, saying bad things about the Orthodox Church or the Orthodox faith was a criminal offense in the Russian Empire. And in turn, the church supported the causes of the state. Its priests and bishops preached loyalty to both the Romanov dynasty and its particular policies and causes. The priests and bishops read out the imperial edicts to the parishioners, and the priests and bishops reported on the condition of their people to the state. And often bishops would be advisors to the imperial government on particular issues of policy in their region. Also, it should be noted that church attendance is mandatory to a certain extent. Basically, if you're Orthodox, you have to attend your church for confession and the Mass, the Eucharist, that is the taking of the blood and the body of Christ, once a year. Now, for the state's perspective, there's one reason for this obligation. It's because when you go and take the sacrament in the church, the priest notes down your name and data. And so therefore, the church acts as a statistics collecting machine. And both today and in the 18th century, data is power. Statistics are power. The more you know about your population, the more you can craft policies directed at particular problems, the more you can target certain groups, the more you can control your empire. And we should remember that from the state's perspective, the church is principally an instrument of control from the perspective of the state. Of course, the church itself has a different perspectives. The church itself is not only guaranteeing the social stability and the social order, but is also acting as a gateway to heaven, to God's kingdom for Orthodox subjects. Now, on our main theme, this is, by the way, worth keeping in mind. This is going to come up over and over again. This idea of Russia as a confessional state over the next few weeks that we discuss this course. But moving more directly onto our theme today of that of church and state. So there has been, over the last 2 decades especially, a lot of debate among historians. So historiography, so this is what we call historiography. That is the writings of historians, okay? And in the historiography, we find that, traditionally speaking, the way historians have discussed the relationship between the church and the state has usually been to emphasize the weakness of the church in the face of the state. There has been use of this phrase, the church was the handmaiden of the state. In other words, the church was simply a servant of the state, something that didn't have its own free will, its own autonomy, its own interests. However, since this idea comes about particularly at the end of the 19th century among anti-church, anti-religious intelligentsia, both in Russia and in the West, and it continues to wield a huge influence in the historical discussions about the Russian Orthodox Church in the Empire until about the 1980s, when the American historian Gregory Fries, on the basis of huge archival research, of huge library research, challenged this notion. Now you can see, I think I've put in the readings for this lecture, Fries's key article from 1985, where he really attacks this notion of the church being the handmaiden of the state. And what Fries basically argued was, well, it's much, much more complicated than this. The church was not simply a servant or a slave of the state. It had its, even though the relationship between church and state was one-sided, the state definitively had more power and was definitely the stronger partner in this relationship. The church did have its own interests and was conscious of these interests. It had a degree, sometimes limited, sometimes more limited than in other periods, but it had a degree of autonomy. And it sought to defend these interests, even against the intrusion of the state. Furthermore, the level of state intrusion into the church was not a constant. It is not a constant level from 1721 to 1917, but rather was heavily dependent on the personalities of the individuals involved. So on the personalities of the particular emperor, of the particular Oberprocurator, if you remember him from yesterday, the particular bishops, the particular leading bishops. It was dependent on their personalities and their relationships. And it was dependent on the context of the times. So in other words, Fries, and I would say most historians after him have reached the conclusion that certainly the church was not a servant or slave of the state in Imperial Russia, but rather it did have some kind of freedom of maneuver and did frequently attempt to resist state intrusions into church business, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. Of course, this is what we professional historians who study this subject think. Still, in the general literature and among non-historians, the idea of the church being subordinated entirely to the state is still prevalent. You know, we've been writing about this now for 40 years, and still the impact we make on the popular impression of church-state relationship in Russia is quite weak. But nonetheless, I'm going to try and present you sort of with an image of, now you've got the context, an image of what is the current historical understanding of the church. This is a church with some degree of autonomy, an ability to recognize and defend its interests, and it's subject, and in a church-state relationship which is subject to historical change. So, Yesterday, we ended with Peter the Great's abolition of the Patriarchate and his creation of the Holy Synod, a collegial body which would now head the Russian Orthodox Church in place of the single figure of the Patriarch. Now, yesterday I was running out of time and needed to sort of condense a lot of complex ideas. So I sort of suggested that the church was, that after this, that the synod was almost something like a ministry in the Russian state. In fact, it isn't really. It's more complex than this. Initially, Peter the Great wanted to make the church into what he called the ecclesiastical college. And that would be a ministry. The ecclesiastical college would be alongside the foreign college, the economics college. It would be a ministry of state. But after a few years of evolution of his views, Peter decided instead to give the synod a different status. We can tell this through the name. The synod was not the ecclesiastical college, simply another department of state. It was called, officially, the most ruling, most holy synod of the Russian Orthodox Church. This distinguished it from a simple college or department of the state. And rather than being subordinated to the state itself, rather the church was subordinated to the emperor. Now, it's a bit confusing, possibly, but I'm going to show you a diagram in a few minutes, which will, I hope, make it much clearer what I mean when I say the church itself wasn't a ministry, at least not in the 18th century. There are certainly attempts in the 19th century, as we're going to see, to make it look more like something like a ministry. But anyway, the Holy Synod. So this new institution that Peter creates in 1721. What is it and what does it do? Well, basically, it is a collegial body where the highest churchmen, the highest bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church sit to make decisions collectively about not only general policy, but also smaller instances, smaller problems occurring within the Russian Orthodox Church. It sits in St. Petersburg. Just go back a second. That's forward. This is the building of the Holy Synod. It's in Senatsky Square. It's actually positioned, so just in front of it is the famous statue of Peter the Great. On the back, on the bronze statue of Peter the Great on horseback. Today, I think it's just government offices, but in the past, this was where the synod met in St. Petersburg. Initially, it had 14 members, most of whom were bishops. There were a couple of priests, usually the priests of the military and court clergy. In other words, the priests who served as chaplains for the army and the priests who served as chaplains for the imperial court, for the members of the imperial family and for their retinues, for their friends and assorted advisors. That was the sole membership of the normal priesthood on the synod. Sometimes they were present, depending on the period, sometimes they were not. Initially, it has quite a large body, about 14, but then immediately it was reduced to 6. This could vary throughout the entirety of this kind of almost 2 centuries long period that we're discussing, but generally speaking, there are about 11 members of the Holy Synod. A constant factor, however, is the presence of the 3 most senior bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church in the Synod's membership. So the chairman of the Holy Synod was always was the Metropolitan of St. Petersburg. The Metropolitan of St. Petersburg was regarded as being the highest churchman the highest ranking churchman in the Russian Empire. Although this status didn't carry any sort of legal advantages or privileges beyond his chairmanship of the Holy Synod. And the metropolitans of Moscow and of Kiev, the other two major historical seats of Orthodoxy in the Russian Empire, also generally speaking, held permanent membership of the Synod. Everybody else was appointed. All the members of the Synod were technically appointed by the Emperor, and generally speaking, the other members could be whoever the Emperor thought was politically appropriate to have in the Synod. So, if the Emperor were, and his advisors, particularly the procurator, wanted to promote a particular bishop or thought a particular bishop was politically useful, then they could be placed into the Holy Synod. Now, the Holy Synod did not sit, by the way, it did not sit constantly. It was not, it met several times, it had several sessions in the course of a year. So that it varied between 3 and 4, basically, over the course of the imperial period. And these would be basically blocks of time, a month, 2 months, usually, where the bishops of the Synod would sit and discuss all of the business that had accumulated in their bureaucracy. And of course, there was a bureaucracy because there was an everyday business had to be dealt with, and it was a bureaucracy. So the Synod had its own bureaucracy, usually sometimes headed by priests, but also headed by secular, non-church bureaucrats. Okay. Another permanent member of the Synod from the 19th century is the Exarch of Georgia. So basically, Georgia becomes part of the Russian Empire at the beginning of the 19th century. And the Georgian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Orthodox churches in the world, is basically assimilated into the Russian Orthodox Church. The Exarch of Georgia is the man who comes to represent the interests of the Georgian Orthodox Church in the Holy Synod. Okay, and he's almost always the Exarch of Georgia is a member of the Holy Synod. Now, we also discussed this figure yesterday, the Procurator. So it was created. This was a position created in 1722, just shortly after the Synod itself was created, and this was basically a secular official who was supposed to monitor and supervise the affairs going on in the Synod on behalf of the Emperor. Now, I want to emphasize this. In the 18th century, he is not a minister of the church. He is more of a communications bridgeway and a representative of the Emperor. So, for instance, when the secular parts of the state, the Senate, the ministries, etc., made decisions, he related to the church, he could communicate those decisions to the Synod, and when the Synod made decisions that impacted on secular organs of power, on the ministries, on other institutions, he could communicate their decisions to the Synod's decisions to these secular institutions. Again, I'm going to show you a diagram, which I hope, if you don't understand what I'm talking about, will make this clear. So the Procurator is never a priest, he's never a bishop, he's always some kind of secular individual and official. Often, most normally, he is an army man. The vast majority of the Procurators were army officers. And some of them were not particularly well suited to the role. This was a political appointment often made for political ends, for simply appointing one's supporters to a lucrative government position. So I've given you the example here of Pyotr Chubyshev, who was in fact an atheist. when he was procurator of the Russian Orthodox Church. Certainly very few of the procurators were people who we would call pious or particularly religious individuals. But that wasn't their purpose. Their purpose was, of course, to act as the servant of the emperor and as a communication bridge between the synod and the secular arm of the state. They weren't required to be particularly religious individuals. So I've given you this helpful diagram, or at least I hope it's helpful. And firstly, I want to point out, we're going to discuss all of this in a second. But I want to point out firstly, you can see here, basically, that the synod is not a ministry. Ministries go here. Ministries are under the Senate, or later the Council of Ministers, or a sort of a high-level cabinet institution. The synod is something different. It's something separate from, generally speaking, the secular organs of the state. The links with those secular organs are firstly the emperor, who is, for all intents and purposes, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, and the procurator, who functions as an interchange, or as the emperor's representative of the synod, and as an exchange of information between the church world, the world of the church, and the world of the secular government. Okay? So I hope that makes a bit clearer, that at this point at least, in the 18th century, it's difficult to call the synod a ministry of the government. It is not really. It is still something different, something with a different status to a ministry. It's not subordinated to the organs of the secular state. It's subordinated to the emperor. Now we're going to, anything else I need to note about this diagram? I think for the moment. That's fine, okay. So, now, we talked a little bit yesterday about the state of the church in the 17th century. The church in the 17th century, and to an extent even during the reforms of Peter the Great, remains a largely medieval institution. It doesn't really possess a bureaucracy to speak of. It doesn't really possess an institutionalized hierarchy to speak of. Generally, how the church operates power is its bishops have a household, they have their palace, and their major servants, their major administrators, are people who live in that palace. They're the bishop's household. That is generally how the church is governed in the 17th century. There had been some attempts in the 17th century to institutionalize the church, to extend its reach, often with the aim of extending the power of the patriarch and the bishops over their lands. Remember, we talked about the vast riches of bishops and the patriarch in the 17th century. And there had been attempts to better exploit these riches by some administrative developments. But to a large extent, the church in the 17th century was a fundamentally undergoverned institution, where individual priests, bishops, could have a large degree of autonomy from their superiors, simply because there were no real mechanisms available to enforce discipline, to enforce instructions over the rest of the church body. Now, knowing what you know, talking about what Peter did, of course, Peter wanted to change this. And already the synod is a development towards a more rationalized, a more bureaucratized, a more institutionalized version of church management. But the reforms of Peter, like in the church, like so many of his reforms elsewhere, take decades and decades to come to fruition. But the change, when it comes, is vast. Indeed, some historians have called it revolutionary, an organizational revolution in how the church is managed. Now, one of the big issues of the 17th century church was it lacked dioceses. So a diocese, by the way, is the administrative area where the bishop rules, okay? Just make sure there's terminology. So the bishop controls an area, that is the diocese of the bishop, okay? Understand? Okay. Diocese, sometimes eparchy, in Russian eparchia, okay? Eparchia, sorry. In 17th century Russia, there are 15 dioceses in the empire. Or, well, not until 1721, the empire, but 15 dioceses in Russia. Yes, it's here somewhere, yes. There are 15 dioceses in Russia. Now, imagine, these things are huge. This is the 17th century Russia. By the end of the 17th century, Russia is bigger than it is today. And there are only 15 units. These dioceses are huge. And all of them are supposed to be run by one bishop and a handful of his staff. So obviously one way of increasing administration and efficiency in the diocese is to create more of them. That's what happened. Between 1725 and 1750 and the 1760s, they basically created more and more dioceses, smaller blocks of territory which were more easily manageable by a single bishop and his staff. That was one approach to making the church a more efficient institution. Another was to introduce the idea of an assistant for the bishop, who also had episcopal, or the rank of a bishop. And so in the 18th century, we increasingly see a new innovation in the Russian Orthodox Church, that of the idea of the suffragan, or the vicar bishop. So the suffragan, vicar bishop, is a junior bishop who assists the main bishop of a diocese with his tasks. And especially from the 1750s onwards, we start to see the emergence of a new church bureaucracy, reaching down into the levels of the dioceses. That is, the main institution that is created are the consistories. The consistories are basically bureaucracies, the bureaucratic mechanisms that exist under the bishops. Generally, they were still small throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. They were generally, they had about 5 to 7 priests and bureaucrats who would join them to deal. But this was the development. This was the extension of bureaucratic reach into the diocese. And as then, the next logical step, of course, was to go beyond, even further down from the diocese to individual districts within each diocese. And so ecclesiastical boards were created, normally headed by about 3 or 4 priests. The ecclesiastical boards would report on and decide matters in a single district of a diocese. And then finally, there was the development of the archpriest. And the archpriest was a church rank given to a relatively senior priest who would then monitor several churches within a district. So by the end of the 18th century, you have had a fundamental change in how the Orthodox Church is administered and organized. From basically a barely administered institution with very few connections to the lowest levels of the hierarchy. By the end of the 18th century, you now had many more dioceses, and each diocese had a consistory, a bureaucratic, official organ producing paperwork. This diocese, the consistory, had underneath it ecclesiastical boards monitoring each district, and under the ecclesiastical boards were archpriests who monitored several churches within that particular district. So in other words, an administrative and bureaucratic hierarchy has been created, which makes the church into a much more modern-looking institution, a much more bureaucratic, a much more rationalized institution, capable of transmitting orders and instructions from the synod to downwards to most parishes, and transmitting information and requests upwards from parish churches all the way to the Holy Synod. Bureaucracy, I know bureaucracy can be a boring subject, but it is important when sort of discussing the modernization of an institution. Now we return, I think, having seen this development of the church, we return to the next big stage in weakening the church's position vis-a-vis the state. Now we remember, in the 17th century, the church controlled huge lands, huge wealth. I think I gave you the example of the Metropolitan of Rostov yesterday, who was one of the wealthiest landowners in Russia, controlling 3,400 peasant households, making him comparable to only 3 or 4 secular aristocrats in terms of wealth. And this situation, Peter did not really change. He certainly put the church lands under more supervision through the synod. He certainly expected the church to give more to his military efforts, but to a large extent, the church had maintained its vast landholdings. Now, of course, possessing land, possessing wealth, can make one into a particular source of opposition. And this is what Catherine the Great, when she came to power in 1762, more or less feared. She believed that the church possessed simply an overwhelming amount of wealth, an overwhelming amount of power, and that it could still be potentially a basis for opposition in terms of its wealth, in terms of the wealth it controlled. And of course, Catherine the Great was a very ambitious woman. She not only sought to launch radical reforms of the Russian state on the same scale of those of Peter, but also waged almost constant wars of expansion against the Ottoman Turks and various other various other states, expanding the Russian Empire. And of course, these reform drives and this military expansion required funding. Just as Peter had basically turned to the church when he needed his wars funded, so Catherine realized the church was a particularly lucrative source of revenue for funding her ambitious domestic and foreign policy objectives. And very early in her reign, barely 2 years after she started, in 1764, Catherine the Great secularized almost all of the church's land. When I say secularized, what I mean is the state took all of the church's land and declared that it was now state land. This meant that all of the serfs belonging to the church now became state peasants. Now, Catherine argued, of course, that the purpose was, well, the church is a heavenly institution. Its goals should be focused on the goals, on spiritual goals. It should be focused on spiritual goals, not on earthly goals relating to collection of rent. And by taking this land off them, I'm doing them a very great favor. You know, I am relieving them of the burden of wealth. Well, this now meant, of course, that the Synod and the entirety of the Russian Orthodox Church is entirely financially dependent on the Russian state, on the budget. Every year, just like every other institution, every other governmental institution in the Russian Empire, the Synod receives a certain amount of money from the state budget. Basically speaking, unfortunately, our studies of this financial relationship are still in a very primitive stage, but basically the money from the state is never sufficient to cover even the basic running costs of the Russian Orthodox Church. And they're certainly never sufficient to cover many of the ambitious programs regarding education and reform that bishops have later in the 19th and early 20th centuries. It's a fact that you should always keep in mind in this course. The Russian Orthodox Church itself is, relatively speaking, a poor institution that lacks monetary means to meet many of its goals. We're going to see this in particular in 2 weeks' time when we talk about priests and the fact that priests did not receive a salary from the church or from the state, at least until the end of the 19th century, and the problems that a lack of salary caused for the Russian Orthodox clergy. And of course, this depriving the church of wealth caused problems for the state's objectives regarding the church. Remember, the state wanted to use the church as a method of political control, but depriving it of the funds necessary to support itself weakened the state's ability to use the church in this capacity. Again, this is something we're going to see in 2 weeks' time when it comes to the priests, who basically, lacking money from the state, essentially were paid by their parishioners, and therefore were not the best supervisors of their parishioners. Not only, of course, did the church as a whole lose its lands, but the monasteries and convents lost their lands. And Catherine had a similar attitude to Peter regarding monasteries and convents. They had to serve a social purpose. If they weren't serving a social purpose, for instance, taking care of wounded soldiers, of retired bureaucrats, of widows and orphan children, then they were useless. In other words, the monasteries and convents dedicated to prayer, dedicated to meditation on God and his existence, were necessarily useless. And so Catherine advanced even further the process that started under Peter of basically closing monasteries and convents. And indeed, by the end of her reign, there were only about, by the end of her process, there were only about 159 monasteries and 67 convents left running of a much, much larger total of near 1,000 monasteries and convents that had been running at the beginning of the 18th century. Now, a fundamental fact here, and I want to make this clear repeatedly, about the Russian Orthodox, about this sort of synodal, this church-state relationship, is in the 18th century, during Peter's reforms, after Peter's reforms, during Catherine's reforms, there are very few churchmen who emerge in direct opposition against it, particularly among the bishops. Very few try to reject this system in and of itself. They might try and carve out autonomy. They might try and reduce the demands on the state, of the state on the church. But there were very, very few bishops who stood up and opposed the system outright. And for good reason. I've given you the example here of the Ukrainian Bishop of Rostov, Arseny Matsievich, who opposed Catherine the Great's, publicly opposed Catherine the Great's secularization scheme, for which he was publicly arrested, publicly stripped of his episcopal clothing, and then deported to the Solovetsky Monastery, which is in the White Sea, an island in the White Sea, and the very far north of Russia, where he was sentenced to hard labor. So in other words, opposition to the state's program of reform in the church could bring very heavy consequences, even for the elite, the ruling elite of the Russian Orthodox Church. Yes, that's. So just before I begin this, I just want to go back to our diagram and introduce two concepts. You don't have to keep them too much in mind because we're going to discuss them again in 2 weeks' time. But I just want to make sure. So basically, in this kind of model, you have two what are called, at least in English we call them, translation we call them domains, in Russian, vedomstva. You have what is called the ecclesiastical or church domain. So this is something, this is the area governed by the church. This is everybody who falls under the control or purview of the church, the ecclesiastical domain. And on the other side, you have what is called the secular domain. So that's everything controlled by, operated by secular institutions, okay? When understanding the 18th century relationship between church and state, one has to understand that the basic, what had been created was the idea in 1721, was the idea that the church, the synod, should have some kind of autonomous control over its own ecclesiastical domain, over people who fell under its control, over the church's individuals who fell under the management of the synod. The synod should have some autonomous management of those individuals, and the secular domain, the ministries and institutions of the state, should not, generally speaking, interfere within that sort of church sphere. And vice versa. The church should not interfere too greatly or without permission within the secular domain. Basically, sort of, you have two spheres, and they are united by the emperor, and the idea is they shouldn't interfere too greatly with each other. The kind of conflict then that emerges in the 18th century is that it is not between church and state. It is rather an attempt by these two spheres to maintain their own autonomy from each other. Now let me give you an example to make this clearer. The state in the 18th century is constantly fighting wars. Almost throughout the 18th century, the Russian Empire is fighting wars against somebody. The Swedes, the Poles, the French, the Turks, just the Prussians, just about anybody it can fight, it is fighting. And therefore there is a desperate need of men. Now, as we're going to discuss in a few weeks, clergymen and their children possessed immunity from conscription. They could not be conscripted into the army. However, the state, the secular domain, consistently attempted to recruit the sons of clergymen into the army to feed this need for soldiers to go and fight in the Russian Empire's war. And this was an area where you saw state and church clash. The church essentially saying, these are our privileges and our rights. The sons of clergymen, as members of the ecclesiastical domain, should not be conscripted. Become soldiers. they should be left within under our control and our supervision, not placed under the army's control and the army's supervision. The church is basically attempting to defend its rights and its privileges over its people. That is the general sort of conflict between church and state that occurs in the 18th century. The church basically attempting to defend those areas where it has control. Okay? Now, the situation changes significantly in the 19th century. As the church, as the state increasingly attempts to bring significant areas of church autonomy to an end. And this is when we can start, in some ways, to begin discussing the church, the synod, and the procurator as something akin to a state relationship. So Alexander I, when he comes to the throne in 1801, he is a reforming Tsar. He was educated by a Swiss philosopher, a Swiss Enlightenment philosopher, quite a radical Enlightenment philosopher. And there was a lot of and the people he appointed around him were young circles of reformers. And a lot of people expected that Alexander would, for instance, try to reform the condition of serfdom, or introduce yet more modernizing reforms into the Russian Empire. Well, firstly, Alexander himself was rather cautious and rather pragmatic and conservative. He didn't want to rush forward too heavily with too quickly and too heavily with many changes. And there was the second event, of course, which determined his outlook on Russia and the world, which was Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812. Napoleon leads the largest army that had ever been seen at the time. About 600 to 750,000 men invade the Russian Empire. They capture Moscow, and Moscow burns down. But the Russians are able to drive Napoleon back, and eventually all the way to Paris. And Russia ends the war along with Great Britain and the Habsburg Empire as a victor. But the experience of the Napoleonic invasion traumatized Alexander, unsurprisingly. He came to the very brink of defeat. Moscow, Russia's ancient capital, burnt down. Most likely by the orders of the mayor of Moscow, but nonetheless it burnt down. And like many people who have been traumatized in such a way, he turned to religion as a source of comfort, and increasingly the rest of his reign, he focused on religion. Now, his religious views weren't particularly orthodox per se, or Alexander was rather ecumenical, he viewed all branches of Christianity as leading to a sort of grand, overwhelming truth. This has two consequences. In foreign policy, Alexander forms what he calls the Holy League, essentially what he wants to be a coalition of Christian states operating together in the name of Christian peace and harmony in the rest of Europe. It doesn't work, obviously, but anyway, he does attempt to lead this diplomatic initiative. And domestically, in 1816, 1817, he tries to essentially bring religion and education more strictly under government control. And he founds what is known as the dual ministry. The dual ministry was basically an attempt to create a ministry of the church and education. During the existence of the dual ministry, there is basically an alternative governing body to the synod. And the procurator of the synod, Alexander's childhood friend Golitsyn, essentially becomes a minister of the Orthodox religion in the Russian Empire. One of the major consequences, at least to begin with, was that the church lost control of its new schooling system. We're going to again discuss it in a later lecture, discuss the schooling system in a later lecture. But it looked like the church was losing a major part of its institution, of its autonomy, to this new state body. Now, if we were to accept the handmaiden of the state paradigm of that previous historians used, we might expect that the church simply did nothing, and sort of this was the will of the state, and we are obliged to fulfill the will of the state. Well, no, in fact, the church does resist quite strongly. And indeed, several figures in the church, leading figures in the church, conspire to bring down both Galitzin and his new dual ministry. The bishop of the Metropolitan of St. Petersburg, Seraphim, is fundamental to this, organizing both public and private opposition to the dual ministry, particularly in the final years of Alexander I. And one of Seraphim's more sneaky tactics was basically to co-opt a rather charismatic monk by the name of Forty Spassky. And Forty, a strange character, was plagued essentially by visions and dreams throughout his life, continually led an extremely strict diet, ate very little, drank very little, but was very charismatic. He wore chains under his clothing to represent his piety. And Seraphim introduced Forty to the Emperor Alexander, and Forty placed the idea in Alexander's head that Galitzin was essentially unsuitable to lead a ministry. Forty said Galitzin was a revolutionary, just like those that had been seen in France, that he was atheist, that he was opposed to Russia, that he was a Freemason, etc., etc., etc. Lies generally, but Alexander was persuaded. And the result of this church, both public and behind the scenes movements against the dual ministry, was that the ministry was abolished. So we see that the church could, through various mechanisms, defend its interests when it perceived those interests to be under threat. Now, however, the church might have been able to deflect the sort of older interests of Alexander. It wasn't able to do the same with somebody like Nicholas I. Nicholas I comes to power in the middle of a coup attempt, the Decembrist coup attempt, when a group of noble army officers essentially attempt to overthrow not only the emperor, but even the imperial order itself. They attempt to create a new constitutional monarchy. And some members of the Decembrist circle go even further than that, wanted even further than that. Nicholas comes to power in the middle of this revolt and suppresses it, and is forever scarred by the experience of this revolt. Believes only a strong conservative reign will be able to guide Russia through the challenges that confronted it. Nicholas, just like Peter, believed that the state had to exercise a strong control over nearly every sphere of life. Nicholas I himself was somebody who dealt with almost every matter of business that came before his desk. He was somebody who refused to delegate. And just as he was in supreme control of the empire's business, so he believed the church had to be firmly subordinated to the state. He was persuaded of this when in the late 1820s, early 1830s, he tried to ask the church itself to introduce new reforms, principally to deal with the problems of the poverty of the clergy. The church took too long. The church bureaucratic processes essentially took too long to propose and implement a reform, and so Nicholas decided to intervene personally into the church, just as he intervened personally into virtually every other sphere of government. Nicholas now decided that he had to impose his own will on the church, and he had the perfect means for doing so in terms of the Oberprocurator, and he appointed the boisterous cavalryman Protazov, who, for all intents and purposes, in the reign of Nicholas I, becomes essentially a minister of religion. Protazov, for the first time, creates the chancellery of the Oberprocurator. So in other words, the Oberprocurator has his own bureaucratic staff, separate from that of the Synod. The orders that the Synod passes in its sessions now have to receive a signature from Protazov in order to become law. And Protazov becomes, Nicholas I and Protazov become obsessed with the idea of control. And so there is essentially, to every consistory, a new secretary is appointed who reports not to the bishop or to the synod, but rather directly to the Oberprocurator. If we go back, you can see this. 1 second before. So you can see this here. This is this position here. Consistory secretary. This is what the Oberprocurator creates, his new bureaucracy creates. So basically, this is a channel through which the Oberprocurator can control and can oversee what is going on in the dioceses. And he really, essentially using the emperor's support, he really treated the synod and the rest of the church much as a ministry would treat any of its employees. If Protazov wanted to remove a bishop, or promote a bishop, or remove a priest, or appoint a priest, then he would do so. Usually because he possessed the almost absolute support of Nicholas. For all intents and purposes, during the reign of Nicholas I, the church essentially did become a ministry, a ministry of religion for the state. However, the basic institutional arrangement that Peter the Great had set up remained in place. The reason Protazov had so much power is because the emperor placed almost unlimited trust in him. And also because most of the people, unsurprisingly, appointed to the synod in this period are, generally speaking, people who support Nicholas's program. Nicholas, by the way, comes up with the formula, well, he's Minister of Education, Sergei Uvarov comes up with the formula that guides Nicholas's government, which is the idea of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. The idea that the Orthodox faith, unlimited government control, and Russian nationhood make it the three principles of Russian government and the guiding principles of Russian policy. And all three of these things had to be subordinated to the will of Nicholas himself. Now, as perhaps you remember from our second lecture, after the death of Nicholas I, his son Alexander becomes Alexander II, and there is a new program of reforms, the so-called Great Reforms, in the 1860s. And these affect the church as much as they affect any other area of society. As you may remember, the greatest of the Great Reforms is that in 1861, the state abolishes serfdom. Now there are many changes also in the church sphere, attempts to modernize and reform the basic institutional structure created at the beginning of the 18th century. The first, the procurator of the early reign of Alexander, was a much more relaxed figure than Protazov had been. He sought to step back and allow the church to decide and deal with its own problems and its own matters. He wanted to give the church the ability to state its interests and state what reforms were needed to support and expand upon its interests. Tolstoy preferred to consult with bishops rather than to issue them instructions, as Protazov had done. He begins to dismantle some of the changes that Protazov had made, like the diocesan secretary. And again, we see something, and again, the sort of bishops who arise in this period into the Synod are people who are bishops who are much more interested in defending the rights of the church from the intrusion of the secular state. Thus, these bishops, when the state takes on policies it doesn't like, these people are much more willing to engage publicly in criticism of the state and attempts to defend what they perceive as the church's interests against incorrect or failed state policies. So, for instance, in the 1860s, the state loosened censorship regulation. The church, well, the Synod at least, was not particularly interested in the loosening of censorship regulations and generally opposed the most radical forms of this change. The church generally also opposed the extension of rights to religious minorities, which Alexander II was, well, at least some members of Alexander II's government were in favouring. And they generally were able to use their presence at court and their public opposition to limit such changes. Again, we see that basically a lot depended, therefore. The level of state intrusion into the church, the level of church subordination to the state, and the level of success in the church's defense of its interests against the state were heavily dependent on personalities involved. The personality of the emperor and the emperor's agenda, the personality of the procurator, and the personalities of the bishops involved. This here is a fundamental point, because the structure of church-state relationship was this synod in the ecclesiastical domain, the bridging figure of the procurator, and the secular domain. It was not the church being a state ministry setup, configuration. And when a less strong procurator or a more flexible procurator took control, the old institutional forms generally emerged again, and the church again resembled less and less a ministry of the state. Okay? Now, we see again another very strong figure holding the autocracy, KP Pobedonosov, Konstantin Petrovich Pobedonosov, at the end of the 19th and in the very beginning of the 20th century. Rather ironically, Pope Benedict was disliked by most of the bishops and a fair few of the priests, although he had his supporters among both groups. Although this is peculiar and somewhat ironic, because he was probably the only really true Orthodox believer ever to hold the position. He was an intensely pious man, who was intensely interested in seeing the spirit of orthodoxy strengthened among the Russian people. However, just as he was a strong believer in the spirit of orthodoxy, he was a strong believer in the Petrine system of state-church relations. Pope Benedict did not and absolutely rejected the idea that the church could have any more independence or autonomy from the state. In his conception, the church had to serve the goals of the Russian autocracy, of the Russian emperor. So Pope Benedict did indeed launch some interesting new reforms of the church. New mechanisms of discussion were established, like local councils in different dioceses, where bishops, priests, and other interested parties could meet to openly discuss new strategies, potential new reforms, and reach a collective conclusion on what was the best way forward. This was why so these were quite new, and in some ways relatively, not radical, but relatively liberal developments. He was responsible for the absolutely massive establishment of church reforms, of church schools, of church schooling in late Imperial Russia. I think I mentioned to you in the second lecture last week, the church controlled a huge number of the brand new schools, of the schools existing in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. And this was largely because Pope Benedict sponsored an absolutely massive campaign of church school expansion. Of course, he believed that doing so was basically a way of cultivating loyalty to the church and loyalty to the state among Russian children, and particularly among the Russian peasantry. But nonetheless, this was certainly a way of expanding the influence of the church in wider Russian society. He was also an active proponent of missions in the Russian Empire, of missionary activities in the Russian Empire. He was extremely well known, for instance, sponsoring the Orthodox Church's missionary activities in Estonia, Latvia, Estland, and Livland, in the proper terms, at the end of the 19th century. Certainly, he was a proponent of Russification as well in these territories. And generally speaking, he supported the mission against Muslims and so-called pagan peoples on the River Volga. He also had absolutely no patience for the old believers, whom he sponsored missionary efforts against. Now, of course, I'm not asking you to support or think positively of these developments, but for the church of the time, this is a positive development. This is a positive thing. The procurator is actively backing its interests, its institutions, its attempts to expand the flock. But on the other hand, by the way, of course, I should mention that Pope Benedict was not only hated by some of the bishops and priests, he was also widely hated by Russian revolutionaries and intellectuals who painted him as sort of the dead hand of reaction in the Russian Empire, and was frequently the butt of satire, as we can see in this sort of cartoon image of him here. And absolutely, Pope Benedict did not. Although he sponsored change and greater church activities, he did not want that change in church activities to occur outside of the control and supervision, firstly of himself, and secondly of the state. And Pope Benedict was particularly worried about any bishops showing any kind of signs of autonomy or desire for autonomy, and was particularly interested in supervising. For the first time, letters between bishops were subject to surveillance to ensure that the bishop could not, the episcopate, that is the collective of all bishops, could not act together collectively. One of the most famous examples of trying to restrict this was when a new bishop was appointed. They were not allowed to go and dine, to have lunch with the Metropolitan of St. Petersburg. When a new bishop was appointed, they would come to St. Petersburg to receive their appointment, but they were not allowed to dine alone with the Metropolitan, because Pope Benedict was afraid of what would happen in that private conversation between the Metropolitan and the new bishop. Furthermore, Pope Benedict, to reduce any attempts to create a sort of local base of support in a particular diocese, Pope Benedict practiced the measure of moving people between dioceses regularly. So it's often the case we find in this late period, bishops in stay in dioceses only for a few years, and then they're moved somewhere else. This is in order to ensure that they cannot develop sort of a local basis of support. Of course, it has the negative side effect is that these bishops never truly get to know the local societies where they're placed. But for Pope Benedict, that's a worthwhile cost. That's a worthwhile expense if it means the bishops remain firmly under the control of himself and the state. All of this, of course, means that already in the 1840s, under Nicholas I and Protozov, there are the first grumblings of discontent with this system emerging. And no longer is this an issue of complaining about individual state intrusions into the church's autonomy. There is increasingly a demand for the change of the system itself, the change to the system that Peter the Great established. Churchmen argue that the Synod, churchmen begin to argue, particularly at the end of the 19th century, that the Synod is not a canonical institution, and nor is the Procurator. What do I mean by canonical? It does not obey or conform to the ancient church laws established in the first centuries of Christianity, the initial and most fundamental laws governing the existence of the Christian church. They are starting to say that the Synod and the Procurator are in contradiction to the most basic fundamental laws of the Orthodox Christian faith. Many are starting to demand new forums, new arenas in which they can publicly discuss and debate without fear of censorship, without fear of surveillance, the problems of the church and the methods of reform. They are starting to demand, for instance, the convocation of a local church council, a sabor in Russian. And the local church council would be an almost unprecedented step. One had not been held in Russia since 1689, since the early years of the reign of Peter the Great. The state had consistently stopped the calling of such a council, precisely in order to not allow the voicing of opposition and criticism to the synodal structure of church-state relationships and the synodal structure of church management. And of course, what is happening, one of the most fundamental rallying points of reform, both for bishops and for priests, is the restoration of the patriarchate that Peter the Great had abolished. The restoration of a single patriarch who would be the main head of the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, I want to emphasize at this point, firstly, I want to emphasize several facts we should keep in mind here. Firstly, this is a very quick summary of the reform scheme. The reform scheme is being proposed. There are many, many distinctions between different camps, different ideologies within the church about what they're proposing. I can assure you we're going to go into some depth about this later. For the moment, you just need to remember the sort of major points. What they're asking for is, in many cases, a restoration of a patriarch. What powers that patriarch would have, how he would work, how that institution would function, was very much a matter of argument and debate. They want a council where they can discuss their problems, what solutions that council would reach, the ones which solutions were the most appropriate for modernizing, industrializing Russia, and for the modernizing, industrializing world, was very much a matter of contention. And I also have to emphasize, even though these churchmen are increasingly demanding more autonomy from the state, they are not demanding the separation of church-state relations. In other words, they continue to support the notion of Russia as a confessional state, a Russia where the Orthodox Church remains the favored confession, and where there is a link between the favored confession and the state. They are not arguing for a modern separation, for the separation of state, of church and state that exists today in many countries. Or very, very few of them are arguing for this. But rather what has come about by 1905, by the revolution of 1905, is a sustained movement within the church, led by bishops, but also led by bishops, priests, church writers, theologians, and many others, demanding the basic, either the abolition of the Petrine system of church-state relations created in 1721, or their amendment. Now, what happens to that reform movement is going to be the subject of a lecture at the end, towards the end, the last weeks of this course. Okay? But let's just summarize what we've gone through today. So again, in 1722, the Old Procurator is not a minister or leader of the church. He is a link between the secular and ecclesiastical domains in the state. He is a watchdog for the emperor, the representative of the emperor in the synod's deliberations. At this point, at the beginning of the 18th century, he does not possess his own bureaucracy. He's often not a person who's even particularly interested in the affairs of religion. He is mainly expected to be a communications link and the emperor's representative. To a large extent, the church had autonomy over its domain, over the subjects over the areas which were directly subordinated to it. Over its emerging schooling system, for instance, over its clergy, over the people who belonged to the clerical grouping The next real blow against this comes with the secularization of church lands in 1764, when the church, for all intents and purposes, loses any financial independence. It is now dependent on the state for all of its financial needs. And whoever controls money, as I'm sure you know, generally has power. Look at the American elections, for instance. And generally in this system, the conflicts between church and state were largely about defense of we're defending the state's intrusions into those spheres where the church had control. We talked about the attempt to make sure the state wasn't conscripting the sons of churchmen, for instance. Okay? Then we see the 19th century where there is a shift, where we see the emergence of powerful procurators backed by their emperors with strong personalities, generally seeking to subordinate the synod much more strongly, to intervene much more critically. But that basic system, I've still got 15 minutes, that basic system of created by Peter does not change. When there is a strong procurator backed by the emperor, certainly the system begins to look like a church ministry. The church begins to resemble a ministry of state. But that is not because of an institutional arrangement, it is because of the personalities involved. And when the personalities change, the institutional arrangement created by Peter emerges once again of a relatively autonomous church with a degree of ability to defend and recognize its own interests. But the challenges, the intrusions created by people like Protozov, like Pope Belonosov, increasingly at the end of the 19th century, have caused tremendous dissatisfaction within all ranks of the church. Certainly there is no unity about which path to go forward, but there is a generalized dissatisfaction with the system that Peter the Great had created. And that general dissatisfaction emerges in 1905 into a general campaign for the reform not only of both church-state relationships and of the Russian Orthodox Church itself. So I hope you can see this sort of debate that I began discussing with you at the beginning of the lecture. The church was not truly a slave or a servant of the state in this period. We see that they are able to block, successfully sometimes, less successfully other times, a state intrusion into their affairs. We see sometimes that the church possesses more autonomy or less autonomy, depending on the personality of their procurator. So the church is not a free agent. It is not an institution that can act freely without state intrusion, without state interference. But nor is it a complete slave to the state. Rather, it occupies a much more complex, much more ambiguous position that changes over the course of time, depending on various personalities and events occurring. Okay? So next time, in 2 weeks' time, when I see you, we're going to move away from a very political, institutional history. Perhaps I apologize if you found it dry, but it is necessary to talk about. We're going to move to I hope, towards looking at the social history, to looking at the priests, the bishops, and the monks in terms of their economic, their social, and cultural life. All right? So we're going to have a look much more, moving away from institutions to look more at people. Okay? So were there any questions at the end of this?
It's not really connected, but it came to my mind. I saw some icons with Nicholas II, or for example, like Dimitri. So how they can believe, or in which way they believe they are saints or Orthodox?
So, Nicholas II, for instance, is conceived of as a saint because he died, because according to the Russian Orthodox Church, he died as a martyr. That is, he was someone who died for the Orthodox faith. And therefore, because he died, this is their suggestion, by the way, this is not what I particularly believe, but they say Nicholas II died for the Orthodox faith, he died in its defense, and therefore he has become a saint in heaven. Dmitry Donskoy, I think, if I remember rightly, is hallowed because he fought for Orthodoxy on the battlefield. He fought against non-Orthodox enemies attacking the Russian Orthodox state, and that is why he's regarded as a state. As a saint.
Not every Tsar
No.
was a saint.
No.
Few.
Very few. I think, let me remember. Nicholas II is Dmitry Donskoy, Alexander Nevsky, Boris and Gleb, a few princesses and princes from some of the smaller Russian princedoms, Prince Vladimir of Kiev, as the baptizer of Russia, but certainly not all. And absolutely people, not Peter the Great, Catherine II, or Nicholas I. No, absolutely not. We're going to discuss, by the way, I think in a few weeks' time, we'll have a look at canonization and precisely how people become saints and the role of saints in the Russian Orthodox Church, okay? And the role they play in Russian Orthodox worship. Okay. Yes?
Yesterday was short introduction to Nikon reforms. Could you have some more view, something more for that?
On Nikon's reforms?
Yeah, Nikon.
Well, firstly, yes. I'm going to have a lecture about Nikon and old belief. Old believers in particular. On Nikon's reforms themselves, so basically, I'm going to be quite quick here. So basically, his fundamental reforms were to make changes to the rituals. So, for instance, rather than crossing themselves with the two-fingered sign of the cross, people had to cross themselves with 3 fingers. Rather than write Jesus in the traditional way, they changed the spelling. So they changed the spelling of Jesus in certain books, in certain prayers. They changed the way certain prayers, certain liturgical chants were spoken, some of the grammatical forms in certain chants. They changed the number of processions around the church. They changed, supposedly Nikon wanted, they changed some of the forms of the cross, for instance, in some Russian Orthodox churches. What else did they do? The number of crossfall breads, etc.
But about this larger impact for this old state or even Orthodox.
Certainly, I mean, basically, they have to fight to try and push these new liturgical reforms, and there is a beginning to institutionalization around these reforms. So they basically try and push the establishment of new schools to try and teach the new reforms. Not many, very, very few of these schools ever created or ever really function. But they increasingly try and do things like increase surveillance of priests to ensure the new liturgical reforms are being conducted. So they do act as an impetus for increasing institutionalization in the late 17th century. But it's certainly not on the scale of institutionalization. Sorry, I've been speaking for 2 hours. That you see in the middle of the 18th century. Okay. On another level, of course, there is the old believer schism, and this leads to the establishment of what is called at the time, later in the 19th century, they call the internal mission. So it begins to be a new Russian Orthodox missionary movement targeted sort of at the old believers themselves. Okay?
Connected to this, were the icons from old believers different from the new one?
It's a good question. Briefly speaking, there are some differences. Iconography in the Russian Orthodox Church, particularly at the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century, begins to adopt models from the European Baroque. If you see these icons today, they look in both sort of in churches, in church painting, and in the icons themselves. They look noticeably something like you would see in 17th and 18th century Italian or French churches. They're representations of Mary. They don't look particularly, well, Russian, to use for lack of a better phrase. They look, they do look like something you'd find in basically Catholic Europe, in Catholic Southern Europe. The old believers, of course, generally speaking, reject these kind of innovations into iconographic practices. They continue to hold to much, much older standards of icon painting. Now, of course, there were icon painters, old believer icon painters in the 20th century. I think of Pitolim Sofronov, who actually was, I think he was from Estonia, if I remember rightly. I can't remember precisely where, but he was a wonderful modern old believer icon painter, who did, of course, start to incorporate not only different techniques and styles into his icon painting, while maintaining a distinctly old believer essence. Okay, is that helpful? I hope so. Any further questions? Wonderful, and we're just a bit early for lunch. So, okay, then I will see you in 2 weeks' time. I will put the 2 lectures from yesterday and today onto the Moodle. Does everyone have access to the Moodle? Yeah. Has everyone seen it, yes? So you can have a look at these lectures again if you want to make more notes, or you want to have another look. Then you can find, I will send you the readings for this week and for the next lectures, okay? So, okay then, no problem.